Hello everyone, and welcome back to Nameless Studio. I'm your host Tyler, and today we're going to continue work on the small 5x7 encaustic piece that we started last time, as well as starting a companion piece to showcase a little bit more of what that new green is capable of. We're still trying to fiddle around with that, as well as just to showcase kind of what connects two pieces. And so why don't we get started? All right, so we're going to jump right in with where we left off with the last piece. And I am going to start kind of taping off elements. If you notice, I'm going to be using a lot of painter's tape as we move along through these videos. I use it for many things, partly to kind of plan out and see kind of how compositional elements can be arranged. Gridding off your substrate can be a nice way of really kind of getting an understanding of where you can kind of place certain elements. So I use it a lot just for gridding and figuring out of placement of things. But also it allows me to block out areas so that when I do some work on top of them, I can work without worry of getting either paint or graphite or other such materials on parts of the substrate that I don't want to. So what I'm doing right now is setting up to actually do some transfer paper gridding on a big swatch of this piece. So just generally kind of figuring out the sort of end lines of where I want those grid patterns to end. And in doing so, that also kind of helps me plan out a little bit about where the next steps might go as well with some of this tape. Allowing some certain elements to pop to the foreground rather than or pushing other ones back. So all I'm seeing is an opaque sort of blocking rather than some of that detail underneath. All right, so now we have it taped off to where I want, but at the same time, part of where my grid lines want to line up is actually underneath the tape. So I'm actually going to cut away some of this tape in order to get exactly what I'm looking for, which is pretty easy. The one thing to keep in mind when cutting on encaustics is if you do cut too deep, you will cut into the wax, so you will leave a divot or a slice in your wax. Or if you cut not deep enough, you won't cut the tape, and so you'll get a soft edge, kind of a frayed edge. So working with the X-Acto knife, especially cutting layers away, tape and whatnot, can be interesting finding the correct pressure to do it, and making sure you have a sharp blade is key. A lot of my blades, I have actually dulled the tips quite a bit, so it can be a little tricky to get it quite right. But now that we've cut that away, I'm going to kind of see which direction I want my lines to go into. And this part, I'm going to cut away in a little bit, but because it's a task of tedium to draw all of these lines. One thing that people always ask when they see my art is, how do you do all of those lines? And the answer is painstakingly, one by one, slowly but surely. So there's no easy way around it. I suppose you could get like a fork or something and kind of grate that across there to possibly get a little bit more marks per minute than you can with a pen. But as far as consistency goes, one by one is the way to go. So as we see, that is now what we have marked down. We are going to untape all this, leaving one of these pieces down, because I'm actually going to kind of paint in a mark where that line is. So I'm going to place tape around both sides of that tape and then remove that one piece, and we will use a new tool, a new medium, in order to mix with the encaustics. Like I said, you'll see tape a lot. I do try and reuse it as much as possible, but painter's tape, it's a good tool to have for many, many reasons. I always keep a few rolls around. All right. So what we're going to break out now as a kind of a mixed media tool to work with the encaustics, one that I use quite a bit these days, are Neo Pastels by Caran d'Ache. These are the Neo Pastel 2s. They're oil pastels that are water soluble. So they work a lot like a wax crayon or an oil wax crayon, and you can actually apply water to them to thin them out, kind of like a watercolor sort of approach in some ways. I use it a bit for sort of my top layers, certain small elements in there, to add color without having to add more of the heated wax elements, partly so I'm not reheating those under layers. I'm able to keep those solid while still adding a good amount of color. There's actually so very much similar to the encaustics, only a much softer wax. You can actually still melt them on the griddle and mix them with the encaustics for a little bit of a more color range, if you're looking to do that. So they are a perfect sort of companion tool to work with your encaustics. Again, these are the Caran d'Ache Neocolor 2 pastels. The Neocolor 1s will work as well. I do not believe those are water soluble, and they're a little harder. So sometimes those can mark or gouge a little bit on this encaustic substrate if you have a lot of wax. So I found I've gotten just a little bit more variety and momentum from the 2s. There's a little bit more you can do with them. They're not cheap. I believe a set of 24 or so is about $90. But to be honest, I don't use a lot of them. I have barely used even a quarter stick on ones that I've used a lot of. So at the moment, I am now adding water to this to sort of flesh it out, get rid of the more crayon-looking marks and make it more of a smooth-looking element rather than sort of marked crayon. So now the one thing about this is this does add a little bit of dry time, because drying liquid on wax itself does take a little time. So while we're waiting for that layer to dry, we are going to start a second piece that will kind of be a companion to this first. Mostly because we still want to experiment a bit with this green. One small little piece doesn't really show the legs of what this green can and can't do. So we're gonna keep on working with it and just see what happens. So that being said, both these pieces still don't really have a thought out composition or theme outside of a general color palette at this point, which is again this kind of forest green and cadmium orange that we have going on. I'd like to keep some organic shapes going on there, with some more geometric shapes, and line elements are really the only sort of stipulations for what we're working with for these pieces. So with that being said, we're going to put down our base coat on this, and as I've said before, with the encaustic medium, you want to heat it to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Make sure your brush is clean. I do have that soy wax back in, so it's much easier to clean my brushes. I am using this white bristle brush instead of the one I used last time, because as I said, that one was shedding a bit. This one is not shed. It is a bit of a smoother application, so that's nice for base layers. Again, you always want to keep your brush as hot as the wax for for a much easier and smoother application process. So that is why I'm keeping the brush heated on the palette quite often. The more it dries out, the harder it's going to be to move across your substrate. So always keep your brush and your wax hot. Some people even keep their substrate hot. They'll actually take a wave of it with their heat gun every time they're doing it, just to create that much more of a fluid surface for them to work on. It also creates a better bond between both layers of your encaustics that you're using. I do not work that way. I actually prefer to have more separation between my layers, so I let my substrate cool completely before going back to it. I do, on the other hand, keep my brush very hot so that I can still have that momentum with my strokes without having to keep my substrate hot. So now we're going to fuse that first base layer, and whenever I fuse it, I actually fuse with the torch in the opposite motion that I brushed, in the opposite motion of the brush strokes. So that just helps hide those strokes that much more. A quick little pass is really all you need. It helps just smooth it out. If you don't, you can leave it that way. You'll have a lot more texture, more bubbles, more crackles. It's a fine way to work too. I like working with a nice, smooth, even substrate to begin with, and then adding my own texture and bubbles and all that stuff as I start to add other layers to it. But you can start off with a fairly rough layer and see how that builds. It can be a lot of fun. So now we're going to start, and we're going to try a little bit more of this fairly new green. This way I'm going to show a little bit more of how the transparency element works. The last one I didn't really show too much of that. So this way I've added a bit of the encaustic medium to the side of it to add sort of a bit of a gradient in the scale of what this green can do. So I'm just sort of applying slightly more transparent strokes as I'm moving over the substrate for this one. So again, this one, even less of a thought as what the composition is going to be. I'm just more just saying like, this is the transparent side of it. So that's what you're seeing here, just slightly more transparent layers as we go. And now we're going to add just a little bit of that cadmium orange to add a little bit of a hint. And as we saw before with the last one, this green, despite being fairly transparent, covers this very opaque orange quite heavily. So I'm just going to use a little bit of it, and we'll see how much it stretches. But these two colors, as well as they work tonally, actually on the palette are they don't quite jive as much as I was hoping they were going to. One definitely overtakes the other much more than I was expecting with these tones. All right. I do have a little tool to move my little palette cups that have more diluted paint in them, because again, this palette is 200 degrees, and even the metal cups that they are in do heat up to the point of moving with your fingers. Can be done, but you don't want to. All right. Again, keep the brush hot. Just a little apply here, a little apply there. And that's all the orange we're going to do on this one for now. All right. So as you can see, that shows a little bit better the transparency element that we have going on with this green. So despite the fact that it does come up as fairly opaque once we heat it, it does have some interesting transparency to it. It's a nice color. I got to find how to use it a little bit better. So I feel like we're going to be seeing this palette off and on for a bit as I try and figure out this color. I want to like it more than it's working right now, but maybe I just haven't found quite the right way to use it. With that said, let's give this a little firing and kind of see how it reacts this time. Again, I use the Iowata torch, butane torch, instead of a heat gun, mostly because I feel like I get more control over my finer motions of melting than you do with a heat gun. So we're going to take this one nice and slow. And because I started with honestly fairly transparent layers, I did add a bit of medium to them. There's not a lot happening in the middle of all that. There's not a lot of gradation. It just kind of instantly went transparent. Transparent, but also semi-opaque. So next time we will dive into this and the other one a bit more. I've been Tyler for Nameless Studio, and until next time, be seeing you.